this whole period is certainly categorized, particularly in like the media, and you even see it now when Reform or the other parties, or even the mainstream parties, honestly, talk about, the high streets looking very similar. The only shops you've got, to your point, are the big institutions, Tesco, Sainsbury's and stuff, and then, barber shops and chicken shops, essentially, because, it's very hard to replace those things online, right? You can't get a haircut online. You can't, get, I mean, they're trying to do food
And the
delivery
end
remotely and
result
stuff.
is a loss. Yeah, and the end result is a loss of identity.
Yeah.
Because when everything looks the same, then people feel like they lose their sense of community and their sense of belonging. Then you might move me here or there, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
And that's, of course, a very kind of sad thing, because in Europe, on average, we tend to have very strong regional identities and local identities. And it's a good thing because that creates community investment into community. And of course, when everything starts looking the same, if that diversity is lost, some people might perceive that as a loss of identity. And this is the funny thing, because the populists are bemoaning that loss of identity, when in fact, the economy is one big driver of that loss of identity. And as I said in this paper, there is sort of this legacy, that fallout from austerity. The unintended consequence was that it actually accelerated a structural transformation of the economy away from the spatial economy towards the online economy, in a way that the consequences were much more strongly felt the smaller the town is. Because the smaller the town is, well, you just can't have as high a diversity of, let's say, restaurants or shops, because the market size gets smaller and smaller. And so you're left with small. Like, I always use the example of London, because in London, you can have, the weirdest shops. I know that there's somewhere in Hackney, there's like a used amp shop.
Yeah.
There's a shop for amplifiers, used amplifiers. This could not survive somewhere in a small town.
No, and it's only allowed to because you have the sheer number of people, not just living in London, but also tourist activity. That you're just not getting the foot traffic to have that level of specialization in a shop in, the rural Reading or something, or up in rural Yorkshire and stuff. And so, the internet's an important part of that as well, in terms of broadening your options for essentially sellers and commerce from, a multitude of areas, even internationally. And so it's basically ended up in that because it's more efficient to do so, you basically get more urbanization. I imagine it's also led to I would imagine at least, led to sort of a perpetuation of urban versus more rural areas, or even like a north-south divide in many instances.
Exactly. And of course, austerity, in particular, the cuts to public spending, to local government spending, they were much more severely felt. In the small communities, if you're a small community is council, you have a lot more sprawl to provide for. So there's a lot more road for the average citizen, so to say, that needs to be maintained, right? Because population is less dense. On average, very deep into the geopolitics of it all as well. You could imagine that, as societies age, we want to pack the population more tightly. It's just more efficient to provide care and provide services, right? But of course, for rural communities, the same amount of cut was doing much more damage, because the responsibilities in upkeep were much higher, and the use of that infrastructure in terms of density was much lower. And so it's kind of an unfair, it's an unfair way of thinking about it. If there's a belief that, the countryside and the city are part of an integrated ecosystem, not in a sort of extracty, unhealthy relationship with one another. But that is, of course, increasingly fraying. And we had our Brexiteers dreaming of the Singapore-on-Thames. The Singapore-on-Thames basically becoming, with London becoming, or the Southeast becoming independent from the rest of the ailing and sick UK. And it would be great to become Singapore-on-Thames, but that means it's a package deal, which means you don't commodify housing.
Yeah.
And that's what they don't do in Singapore.
And it's certainly been perpetuated. The wealth inequality in the UK compared to like some other countries that we would perhaps like to compare ourselves to is exacerbating. And I think from all the the media attention around this is actually relatively high now. But ultimately, London is essentially doing well, very well. Southeast is doing pretty well, and then the rest of the the UK is basically a net, at least in terms of like tax revenues, and also it's basically a drain on tax revenues. It's creating this crazy north-south divide that's kind of perpetuating.
Yeah.